I'm glad that I try not to let hype or preconceived notions influence my approach to individual movies much, because as a huge Tucker and Dale vs. Evil fan going into this movie, the disappointment would have devastated me. This movie is awful, and it's made even more awful coming on the heels of one of the best horror comedy films of the past several years, if not one of the best horror comedy films ever made. Tucker and Dale vs. Evil is a slasher film parody that's as good-natured as it is subversive, questioning classist tropes about psycho rednecks without being heavy-handed or preachy. It's a really rare balance of gore, humor, and heart, and I can't recommend it enough, especially if you want to get more into horror, or at least meta-horror, and want something that isn't dour torture porn. There's one wildly out-of-place rape joke at the end that doesn't fit the tone of the film even slightly, but the rest of it is perfect. I felt with Okja that maybe Bong Joon-ho should have been reeled in a little bit by Netflix, and Little Evil is similar, but so much worse. It feels like a first draft, first feature screenplay, not a sophomore film, and the same goes for the editing and the cinematography. Tucker and Dale doesn't have a particularly striking visual or editing style, but both are competent and service a clever screenplay and great performances. Little Evil looks and plays like Edgar Wright was kidnapped and forced to direct a made-for-TV Omen parody. There are a couple of fun shots, but it's mostly boring, standard coverage, interrupted by knockoff Wright transitions that are jarring and unnecessary to the extent that they're perplexing. Scott was already in a perfect comedy horror movie. It's called Krampus, and he does his best here, but Krampus gave him so much more to work with, and his performance in that film is more believable and compelling. Tucker and Dale doesn't have as many illusions as something like Cabin in the Woods or Shaun of the Dead does. It's more of a play on a host of cliches rather than direct references. Little Evil steps up the references, but they're all insultingly shallow. The Omen is the most obvious here, but bits and pieces bring up The Shining, Poltergeist, maybe The Babadook, definitely Ghostbusters. But it's mostly just easy visual homage as a gag or an attempt at a scare, or even just characters saying the words Gozer and Keymaster. It's not nearly as bad as something like Epic Movie, but it's similar in how it throws references hoping to endear itself to an audience or get a laugh. What makes Shaun of the Dead an incredible film is the fact that it's a frightening zombie movie with emotional depth that also has a dense script packed with allusions and Easter eggs, not just a subpar comedy script with horror references tacked on. The only positive thing I can really say about Little Evil is one of the main characters is a trans man, and he's handled pretty well. I mean, best case scenario is getting actual trans actors for trans roles, but barring that, it's neat to see a trans man just be one of the dudes, and it reminds me of trans people I actually know. Not a hateful stereotype, but not a perfect idealized representation either. He's just a dude. I've seen at least one review and the wiki page call Al a lesbian, but to me, if you have a dude saying, "Hi, I'm Al, I'm a dude, and a stepdad," just let him be a dude. Maybe it's some big dumb joke that went over my head about a butch lesbian being masculine, but my interpretation and what seems to be the wider interpretation of the LGBT community around this film, especially giving the benefit of the doubt because Tucker and Dale's a relatively sweet, progressive film, is that Al is a dude, and I liked him. One progressive choice is never enough to carry a film though, and the rest of the movie just sucks. It's a shame Little Evil ended up the way it did. I think it could have made a fun, low-budget TV show or miniseries. It isn't as good, but it reminded me of Todd and the Book of Pure Evil, a really weird and hysterical Canadian cult show that combines crass dark humor with a cult, stoner, and heavy metal imagery. I could see this working as a Todd or a Psych or a Reaper or a Pushing Daisies. Just a fun, quirky TV show with some horror or dark comedy elements, rather than an awkward and rushed movie. As is, this is maybe the worst new movie I've seen this year, even if just from a screenwriting and editing standpoint. The horror illusions don't really work past a surface level, so it won't appeal much to horror nerds, and it isn't funny or scary enough to appeal to a wider audience. You'd be better off watching Todd or Tucker and Dale, the former using a campy, schlocky lens to be endlessly creative and surprising, and the latter performing a wonderful balancing act between gore and lighthearted humor, rather than spending time with this movie. Morgan Jurgensen was credited as a screenwriter on Tucker and Dale, while Little Evil was a solo effort by Eli Craig, so maybe some of the spark and intelligence and creativity went with him. I have no idea. Either way, the world didn't need a shallow Omen parody, especially in 2017. Craig is undoubtedly talented, and I'll still be keeping up with his releases, but as far as Little Evil is concerned, someone at Netflix, or just generally someone who cares about him, should have given him some notes. Hey, thank you for watching! If you enjoyed this, check out the other reviews, video essays, and short films on my channel. If you want to check out something on Netflix that I actually did enjoy, watch BoJack Horseman or Okja. If you have some spare money, please consider donating to my Patreon, so I can keep making videos like this one. Thanks!